All she wanted was to withdraw her own money until the bank manager's harsh words humiliated her. But then her son walked in, and everything changed. Marjorie Whittaker believed in routine. It gave her life a sense of order, a rhythm she could trust. Every first Monday of the month, she walked into Riverstone First Bank in Sacramento, California, the same branch she had used for over 20 years. The tellers knew her by name, and she knew theirs. That familiarity brought comfort. But today, something felt different. The usual friendly chatter was gone. The warm greetings, now replaced by quick, nervous glances. At the reception desk, a young woman who always smiled kept her eyes fixed on the computer, avoiding Marjorie's gaze. She adjusted the strap of her purse and moved forward, ignoring the strange tension in the air. At the counter, she pulled out her checkbook, filled out a withdrawal slip for $3,000, and slid it across the polished surface. It was just enough to fix her leaking roof before the rainy season returned. She placed her ID beside it. A simple routine. But then, a sharp, clipped voice broke through the silence. "Can I help you?" Marjorie turned. A woman she had never seen before stood behind the counter. Victoria Langford, the new branch manager, mid-40s, impeccably dressed, dark blonde hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful. A clipboard tucked at her side. A faint smirk on her lips. Marjorie met her gaze and offered a polite smile. "Yes, I'd like to make a withdrawal." Victoria barely glanced at the slip before speaking. "And you are?" The question landed like a slap. "Excuse me?" Victoria's expression didn't change. "I don't recognize you. Large withdrawals require extra verification." Marjorie straightened, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. "I've banked here for 20 years. Victoria's smirk didn't waver. "That may be, but policy is policy." A familiar heat crept into Marjorie's chest. She had heard that tone before. This wasn't about policy. This was about power. Keeping her voice calm, she replied, "You can check my account history." Victoria sighed, tapping her manicured nails against the counter. "I still need to verify the funds. You understand, we've had incidents." The word hung in the air. Incidents, misunderstandings, the kind that only seemed to happen to people like her. A few customers began watching. A man near the deposit slips shifted uncomfortably. A young woman, pretending not to listen, stole glances at them. Marjorie's hands trembled as she reached into her purse for her phone. There was only one person she trusted to handle this. And Victoria had no idea who was about to walk through that door. Marjorie's fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating for just a second. She hated this feeling. The lump in her throat. The sting of being reduced to someone suspicious in a place that should have felt safe. She had never caused trouble, never bounced a check, never been late on a bill. Yet here she was, a retired teacher, a grandmother, a loyal customer, being treated like an intruder in her own bank. Victoria leaned in slightly, that smirk still in place. "If you can't provide additional identification, I'm afraid I can't authorize this withdrawal." Marjorie took a steady breath. "My ID is right there." Victoria barely looked at it. "And I need further proof. You understand, it's just protocol. Protocol. A word that had a way of twisting itself into something ugly when used to justify a wrong." Marjorie didn't want to cause a scene, but she felt trapped. If she walked away now, what would stop this woman from doing the same thing next time? If she let this slide, what message would that send? The air in the room grew thick. The young teller at the next window stole nervous glances at Victoria, unsure whether to step in. The security guard near the entrance shifted on his feet, watching. Marjorie steadied her hand and pressed her son's number. The dial tone rang. Once, twice. Then, "Hey, Ma, you okay?" Relief flooded through her, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm at the bank. Can you come down here?" A pause. Christopher knew her well enough to catch the tension in her voice. "I'm on my way." She ended the call, slipped the phone back into her purse, and waited, because everything was about to change. Victoria let out a short, amused breath. "Calling for backup?" Marjorie met her eyes, her voice steady, firm. "Something like that." For the first time, Victoria hesitated. She had no idea that backup was about to walk through that door, wearing a tailored suit, carrying a name that held far more weight in this bank than hers ever would. The doors swung open, and in stepped Christopher Whitaker, tall, sharp-dressed, confident. He carried the quiet authority of a man who knew exactly who he was. His gray suit, crisp, his shoes polished, and the moment he walked in, the room shifted. The tellers sat up straighter. A security guard, who'd been casually watching from the side, suddenly looked more alert. Even the customers in line glanced over, sensing something had changed. Christopher didn't need to announce himself. His presence spoke for itself. He spotted his mother at the counter, and then he saw the way Victoria was looking at her, dismissive, irritated, as if she were an inconvenience. His jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his voice was smooth. "Mom, what's going on?" Victoria's eyes flicked between them. She straightened, forcing that smug expression back into place. "And you are?" Christopher didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at his mother. He saw the way she held her purse, a little too tightly, the way her lips pressed into a thin line. He understood. Instantly. Turning back to Victoria, his gaze was steady. Christopher Whitaker. Silence. For a split second, something flickered in Victoria's eyes. Recognition. But she didn't react fast enough. One of the tellers, a young man who had been watching nervously, broke the silence. "That's Mr. Whitaker, ma'am." His voice was quiet but firm. "The new owner." Victoria blinked. "Owner?" Christopher smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Majority owner, to be exact." His voice was calm, controlled, and, from what I can tell, my mother was just trying to make a simple withdrawal. So, tell me, why exactly is there a problem? Victoria's confidence cracked. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Marjorie finally spoke, her voice steady, the voice of a teacher who once commanded a classroom full of restless students. She said she needed to verify the funds. Christopher let those words hang in the air. Then he turned back to Victoria. "Is that so?" Victoria swallowed hard. "We have policies." Christopher's polite tone didn't change, but there was an edge to it now. "Policies that somehow only applied to my mother today?" Victoria scrambled to recover. "It was just a misunderstanding." Christopher nodded slowly, as if considering that. "I see." Then his voice lowered, calm, measured. "Tell me, Victoria, how often do these misunderstandings happen?" A flicker of panic crossed her face, because they both knew the answer. And Christopher wasn't done. The room was so silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. All eyes were on him, on her. The energy had shifted. This was no longer just a routine bank visit. This was something bigger. Victoria straightened, trying to regain control. "Mr. Whitaker, I assure you this was nothing more than a simple policy matter." Christopher tilted his head slightly. His voice was calm, almost amused. "A simple policy matter? but his gaze, sharp, unwavering. Let's be clear about something. He took a step closer. My mother, an account holder of over 20 years, was publicly humiliated while trying to withdraw her own money. And you're telling me that's just policy. Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. She was on thin ice. Marjorie let out a slow breath. I've never had a problem before, not until today. Christopher nodded. Exactly. Then he turned to Victoria. So tell me, why was today different? The weight of that question landed like a hammer. Victoria's face twitched. She clung to one last excuse. We just have to be cautious about large cash withdrawals. It's about security, you understand? Christopher chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Security? He glanced across the bank. His eyes locked on a man at the far end, someone who had just walked away from the counter. That gentleman over there just withdrew cash. His gaze snapped back to Victoria. I didn't see you questioning him. Silence. Victoria stiffened, but she said nothing. Christopher leaned in slightly, his voice lowering, but making sure everyone still heard. This wasn't about security. This was about power. You thought you could get away with it, that no one would step in. Victoria swallowed. Her silence said it all. And Christopher? He wasn't finished yet. Christopher let out a low chuckle, but there was no warmth in it. Security, right? His eyes swept across the bank, then landed on a man at the far end, someone who had just finished a transaction and walked away from the counter. That gentleman over there just withdrew cash. I didn't see you questioning him. Victoria stiffened, but she said nothing. Christopher leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice, but making sure everyone still heard. This wasn't about security. This was about power. You thought you could get away with it, that no one would step in. Victoria swallowed hard. There was no escaping this now. Behind her, the tellers stood frozen, watching. Their boss, the one they feared, was squirming under the gaze of the man who now had the final say over her career. Christopher exhaled, straightening. I'm going to make something very clear. His voice was steady, controlled. This is my bank now, and there is no place here for someone who treats customers, especially long-time loyal customers, like criminals. Victoria's face went pale. She stammered, I was just following. Christopher raised a hand. You can stop now. You've said enough. Without another word, he turned to his mother. Do you still want to withdraw the money, Ma? Marjorie smiled, for the first time since she had walked in. Yes, I do. A young teller, one who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes, rushed forward to assist her. Victoria stood frozen, realizing too late. She had just cost herself everything, but the real consequences were still coming. She stood there, rigid, the carefully maintained poise she once had, crumbling. The weight of the room's silence pressed down on her. The other employees, they weren't stepping in. They weren't defending her. They weren't even making eye contact. They knew. Everyone knew. Christopher turned to the young teller assisting his mother. Her hands were quick, but now there was no hesitation. Take care of her, Christopher said. Make sure she gets what she came for. The teller nodded. Her eyes flickered between Christopher and Victoria, then back to her job. Victoria, however, still clung to some last shred of hope. She straightened her blazer, tried for a controlled tone, but her voice betrayed her. Mr. Whitaker, I understand that you're upset. Christopher didn't let her finish. His voice, sharp and even. No. what you don't understand is that this isn't just about my mother." The sharp edge returned. "How many other customers have you treated this way? How many people have walked in here, only to be met with your so-called policies?" Victoria's mouth opened. No words came out. Christopher exhaled, shook his head. "This isn't a conversation anymore." Then he turned and locked eyes with Andrew Hastings. At some point during the exchange, the regional director had arrived, standing back, observing, a seasoned executive, his face unreadable. But Christopher knew exactly what his presence meant. Andrew stepped forward, cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitaker, if you'd like to discuss staffing decisions privately—" Christopher waved a hand. "There's no need." Then he turned back to Victoria. "Victoria, you're done here." She flinched, as if she'd been struck. "Wait. Effective immediately," Christopher continued. "Your position as branch manager is terminated. I'll make sure your severance paperwork is handled accordingly." The words landed hard. A few gasps rippled through the employees, but no one looked surprised. Victoria turned stark white. She wasn't just losing a job, she was losing power. And she knew it. She had gotten comfortable, thought she was untouchable. Now, the very person she had tried to humiliate had taken everything from her. For a moment, she stood there, blinking rapidly, trying to compose herself, trying to salvage what little was left. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit. She didn't bother looking back. The heavy glass doors closed behind her. And just like that, Riverstone First Bank had one less problem. As the doors shut, the tension in the bank shifted. Employees who had been frozen exhaled. Customers who had been pretending not to listen resumed their business. Tellers exchanged quick glances, processing what had just happened. Christopher turned back to the counter, where his mother stood. The teller assisting her was counting the money carefully. This time, her hands were steady, the fear that had been there moments ago gone. As Marjorie collected the cash and tucked it neatly into her purse, Christopher spoke again, but this time, he wasn't just talking to Victoria. He was talking to everyone. His voice carried through the bank, firm but not harsh. "I want something to be clear. This isn't just about my mother. What happened today is exactly what won't happen again in this bank." Andrew Hastings, still standing nearby, gave a slight nod. He knew this was coming. Christopher continued pacing slowly. "Every single employee in this branch needs to understand. Our customers, the people who trust us with their money, their savings, their future, are not to be treated as inconveniences." He looked around. "They are the reason this institution exists." A few tellers shifted uncomfortably. Most looked attentive. "We will be reviewing every single case of so-called policy enforcement from the past 6 months. His tone sharpened. "If I find even one more example of bias, unnecessary scrutiny, or selective enforcement of rules, there will be consequences." Rebecca lowered her eyes, her face tight with quiet understanding. She had likely seen it happen before, but hadn't spoken up. Christopher met her gaze. If anyone ever feels pressured to uphold a policy that doesn't align with fairness and respect, "My door is open," Rebecca nodded. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of relief. Marjorie had been silent throughout the speech. Now she finally turned to her son. "Let's go." Her voice was steady, and there was something in her expression, something that felt lighter. Christopher gave a small nod, placing a hand on her back as they walked toward the doors. As they stepped outside into the afternoon light, Marjorie took a slow breath. "You didn't have to do all that, you know." Christopher smirked slightly. "Yeah, I did." She studied him for a moment, a slow smile forming. "Well, you always did have a way of handling things." Christopher chuckled. "That's what I'm here for." Behind them, Riverstone First Bank was already starting to change. But the real impact wouldn't be in what happened inside today. It would be in how people were treated there from now on. As Christopher and Marjorie walked toward the parking lot, the weight of the day still lingered between them. For Marjorie, it wasn't just about today. It was about every time someone like Victoria had made someone like her feel small. It was about all the times she had chosen to walk away instead of fight. But today, thanks to her son, she didn't have to. She unlocked the car, but before getting in, she turned to him. "You didn't just fire that woman. You made a statement." Christopher leaned against the passenger door, arms crossed. That was the point. She studied him, the sharp angles of his face, still carrying traces of the little boy she had raised. "You always did know how to handle yourself." He smirked. "Learned from the best." Marjorie shook her head, but this time she was smiling. "This isn't the first time I've been treated like that, you know." Christopher's jaw tightened slightly. His fingers drummed against the car door. "I figured as much." She hesitated. Then, with a slow breath, she said it. "But it's the first time I've ever seen someone actually held accountable." Christopher met her eyes, the hint of frustration still there. "That's the problem, Ma. It shouldn't have to take someone like me walking in to fix it." She exhaled, nodded slowly. "You're right. But that's why today mattered." For a moment, they just stood there, the California sun warming their skin, the hum of passing cars filling the silence. Finally, Christopher spoke. "I'm making sure every branch under my ownership knows what happened here. They're going to remember what respect looks like, and what happens when you refuse to give it." Marjorie placed a hand on his arm, squeezed gently. "You did good today." Christopher gave her a small smile, then reached for the door handle. "Come on, I'm taking you to lunch, my treat." She chuckled as she slid into the driver's seat. "Now, that's an offer I won't argue with." As they pulled away, the bank shrank in the rearview mirror. But the impact of what had happened inside would remain, not just for Victoria, not just for the employees, but for every single person who walked through those doors from this day forward. As Christopher and Marjorie drove through the streets of Sacramento, the weight of the day slowly began to fade, but its lesson would last. Marjorie glanced at her son, her heart full, not just with pride, but with something deeper, vindication, justice. For once, someone had stood up when it mattered, and not just anyone, her son. She thought about all the times in her life when she had been treated differently, for no reason other than someone thinking they could get away with it. People like Victoria? They thrived in systems that let them operate unchecked. But today, that cycle had been broken. Christopher, one hand on the wheel, turned to her. "You okay?" She exhaled, nodded. "I am now." They didn't need to say much more. Some things didn't need words. They just needed action. The story wouldn't end. They're back at Riverstone First Bank. Employees still whispered about what had happened. Tellers exchanged knowing glances. Policies were already being reviewed. And the customers who had witnessed it. They'd tell the story, a story about a woman who walked into her own bank, was humiliated, and for once in her life saw justice in real time. Victoria Langford. She would find another job eventually, but she would never forget this day, because the next time she thought about treating someone differently, she'd remember how quickly power could shift, and maybe, just maybe, she'd think twice. Respect is free, but too often, people like Victoria don't pay it forward until they're forced to. If you've ever seen something like this happen, or worse, if you've been in Marjorie's shoes, know this: you deserve better. Stand up when you can. Speak out when you must. And if you ever find yourself with the power to make a change, use it, because moments like this, they matter.